of the David story. As you may recall, we did an introduction to the books of Samuel and Kings last time, and we talked about the narrative of this story, the story that takes us from prophets into a king for Israel. And tonight we are going to be spending our time talking about Saul. As I've said before, this narrative, it reads often like a great short story or a great novel. And as much as we will have time to interpret it, it's so important that we are able to hear the narrative itself. It's just a great story. So you could think about this time with your rabbi as, story time with Rabbi Schachter. Curl up by the fire and let me spin you a yarn. And I don't want to say too much about Saul before we get in there, because the narrative really tells us a lot about him. We are also blessed tonight to have our very own Professor Adrienne Rubin, who will be interpreting a work of modern art that explores Saul as well. So we will be thinking about Saul through the biblical text. We will be looking at a few secondary texts, and we will be looking at a work by Jack Levine as another form of commentary on this text. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody, and we're going to jump right in to learning about Saul, our first king. Okay. Okay. The David story, the narratives of Saul. First and foremost, I want to give credit where credit is due. Much of the discussion that we're going to be having tonight was inspired by a teacher of mine, Dr. Erica Brown, who is an incredible scholar and author. And in addition to teaching texts from the Jewish tradition, she also teaches classes on leadership. And I think that that's important to share, because what we're going to be talking about over the next several months is in many ways the story of leadership models, both successful leadership models and really failed leadership models. And so we're going to look tonight at Saul, who he is, and what kind of a leader he is. So let's jump in. We're going to start with in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel. So for those of you who want to be looking along at home, you're welcome to do that. But I have all the text that you're going to need here on the screen tonight. Okay. Is there anybody who wants to volunteer to read? No,
I see Leslie Woolen's hand, I think. Right, Leslie? You just need to unmute.
Your hand, my favorite narrator.
Okay, here we go. Thank you for the compliment.
Okay, Leslie, just read this part and then we'll switch, okay?
Okay. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bekorah, son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of substance. He had a son whose name was Saul, an excellent young man. No one among the Israelites was handsomer than he. He was a head taller than any of the people. Once the asses of Saul's father Kish went astray, and Kish said to his son Saul, Take along one of the servants and go out and look for the asses. He passed into the hill country of Ephraim. He crossed the district of Shalisha, but they did not find them. They passed through the district of Shalim, but they were not there. They traversed the entire territory of Benjamin, and still they did not find them. When they reached the district of Zoph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Let us turn back, or my father will stop worrying about the asses and begin to worry about us." But he replied, "There is a man of God in that town, and the man is highly esteemed. Everything that he says comes true. Let us go there. Perhaps he will tell us about the errand on which we set out." Saul said to his servant, "A good idea. Let us go."
Thank you, Leslie. Already you can see that this is a great dramatic tale, right? It sounds like a fable or a fairy tale, right? Once upon a time, there was a man, this is where he was, and then there's some kind of episode that's going to show us things about his character, and there's going to be a turning point where we are able to learn something about his life, right? So, we see Saul here as he has many descriptors, which we're going to reflect back on afterward, about what kind of a son he is, what kind of a person he is, what he looks like, which is always very important in a Torah narrative. When you hear that somebody is unusually attractive or tall, that's a light vort for us. That's a signifier for us that we should pay attention to this person. And he's on this mission to find his lost donkey. And it brings him to the next chapter, right? Brings us to the next chapter of this story. So what happens in the next chapter? Let's find out. And they went to the town where the man of God lived. As they were climbing the ascent to the town, they met some girls coming out to draw water. They asked them, "Is the seer in town?" "Yes," they replied. "He is up there ahead of you." So they went up to the town, and as they were entering the town, Samuel came out toward them on his way up to the shrine. You guys remember Samuel from last time, right? Samuel is our prophet, and we know that when last we saw Samuel, things weren't looking so good for him in the narrative, and people wanted to bring in a king, right? So it says, "Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed the following to Samuel. At this time tomorrow, I will send a man to you from the territory of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him ruler of my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hands of the Philistines, for I have taken note of my people. Their outcry has come to me." As soon as Samuel saw Saul, the Lord declared to him, "This is the man that I told you would govern my people." Saul approached Samuel inside the gate and said to him, "Tell me, please, where is the house of the seer?" And Samuel answered Saul, "I am the seer. Go up ahead of me to the shrine, for you shall eat with me today. And in the morning, I will let you go after telling you whatever may be on your mind. As for your asses that strayed 3 days ago, do not concern yourself about them, for they have been found. And for whom is all Israel yearning, if not for you and all your ancestral house?" Saul replied, "But I am only a Benjaminite from the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my clan is the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin. Why do you say such things to me?" Samuel took Saul and his servant and brought them into the hall, and gave them a place at the head of the guests, who numbered about 30. And Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the portion which I gave you and told you to set aside." The cook lifted up the thigh and what was on it and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, "What has been reserved is set before you. Eat. It has been kept for you for this occasion, when I said I was inviting the people." So Saul ate with Samuel that day. So far, what do we see? Samuel is a prophet. God has said to him, you need to get this guy Saul. He's going to be your king. And we see that Saul is kind of going along with it reluctantly, hesitantly. He's not really sure what's going on, but he is brought into the fold, and Samuel goes out of his way to make sure that he is in a position of power, right? He sits at the head of the table. He has a special food brought out to him, and then he gets anointed. Samuel took a flask of oil and poured some on Saul's head and kissed him and said, "The Lord herewith anoints you ruler over his own people. When you leave me today," here now Samuel's giving him another prophecy, "you will meet 2 men near the tomb of Rachel in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah, and they will tell you that the asses you set out to look for have been found, and that your father has stopped being concerned about the asses and is worrying about you, saying, 'What shall I do about my son?' You shall pass on from there until you come to the terebinth of Tabor. There you will be met by 3 men taking a pilgrimage to God at Bethel. One will be carrying 3 kids, another will be carrying 3 loaves of bread, and the third will be carrying a jar of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall accept. After that, you are to go on to the hill of God, where the Philistine prefects reside. There, as you enter the town, you will encounter a band of prophets coming down from the shrine, preceded by lyres, timbrels, flutes, and harps, and they will be speaking in ecstasy. The Spirit of the Lord will grip you, and you will speak in ecstasy along with them. You will become another man. And once these signs have happened to you, act when the occasion arises, for God is with you. After that, you are to go down to Gilgal ahead of me, and I will come down to you to present burnt offerings and sacrifices of well-being. Wait 7 days until I come to you and instruct you what you are to do next." As Saul turned around to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart, and all those signs were fulfilled that same day. And when they came there to the hill, he saw a band of prophets coming toward him. Thereupon the Spirit of God gripped him, and he spoke in ecstasy among them. When all who knew him previously saw him speaking in ecstasy together with the prophets, the people said to one another, "What's happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul too among the prophets?" But another person there spoke up and said, "Who are their fathers?" Thus the proverb arose, "Is Saul too among the prophets?" And when he stopped speaking in ecstasy, he entered the shrine. Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, "Where did you go?" "To look for the asses," he replied. "And when we saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel." "Tell me," said Saul's uncle, "what did he say to you?" Saul answered his uncle, "He just told us that the asses had been found." But he did not tell him anything of what Saul had said about the kingship. Okay, I just want to pause here. We have one more scene in this chapter to just open it up. I've been reading for a long time. Leslie, I did not give you a big enough job. What's coming up for you here? What do we notice so far about this story? Just anything on your mind, just shout it out loud. Everybody's going to be like, "Oh yes, I noticed that too."
Niesenbaums, I see you unmuted.
So the anointment of the kingship is semi-secretive. It's not like he was declared in a Disney movie, "You are the king." It was a small dinner party, and he kept it to himself as well.
Yes, good, very good observation. Okay. And
What I noticed was the three men bearing gifts, which reminded me of another story that is in the public knowledge.
okay, great. We will talk about a few of the, not of the Christian similarities, but this story definitely is an archetype, right? It's definitely a story that sounds familiar to us. We by the way that the story is being told, we already know what's going to happen, right? That's one of the gifts of our sacred text.
He also seems to be a reluctant leader, which is a theme that we've seen before.
Good. Okay, we're going to get back to that. What
And I
else?
also want to say, thereupon the Spirit of God gripped him and he spoke in ecstasy among them. What does that mean?
Was he
yeah.
speaking in tongues? Is that what he was doing? Like speaking in tongues?
In ecstasy. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it means that he is like, I mean, I wouldn't call it speaking in tongues, but yeah, like the spirit is moving him in a way that is not his natural way, right? So he's, it seems like he's touched by God, or that he's speaking what God wants him to speak rather than his own thoughts.
It seems to me that it's almost very naive or very innocent that somebody tells you you're going to be the king. Nobody knows who you are and everybody's going to accept you and you just can go and do this.
Right. Well, and also like nobody's ever been the king before. So that must be a big shock on top of that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I see Abby. You want to share something?
It seems like he is taking this job and running with it. It's like he's gotten confidence and maybe I could do this.
Okay, great. So I wanna keep going because I think that there are a few things that seem like he's not necessarily running with it, right? Like a little bit of reluctance. He doesn't tell his dad, like, oh, and then Samuel told me I'm going to be king. You know, there's some kind of hesitation there. But let's read this next scene. It's one of my favorite scenes. Okay. Does anybody want to read this next scene? Anne, Keith, somebody over there, are you raising your hand? Somebody? Yes, great, do it.
All right, I'll give it a shot. Samuel summoned the people to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But today you have rejected your God who delivered you from all your troubles and calamities. For you said, 'No, set up a king over us.' Now station yourself before the Lord by your tribes and clans." Samuel brought forward each of the tribes of Israel, and the lot indicated the tribe of Benjamin. Then Samuel brought forward the tribe of Benjamin by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was indicated. And then Saul, son of Kish, was indicated. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. They inquired of the Lord again, "Has anyone else come here?" And the Lord replied, "Yes, he is hiding among the baggage." So they ran over and brought him from there. And when he took his place among the people, he stood a head taller than all the people. And Samuel said to the people, "Do you see the one whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people." And the people acclaimed him, shouting, "Long live the king." And Samuel expounded to the people the rules of the monarchy and recorded them in a document which he deposited before the Lord. Samuel then sent the people back to their homes. Saul also went home to Gibeah, accompanied by upstanding men whose hearts God had touched. But some scoundrels said, "How can this fellow save us?" So they scorned him and brought him no gift, but he pretended not to mind.
Excellent. Okay. So, Abby, do we still think that he's running with it?
Running is the right word, but it seems to me that he's, he didn't tell his dad, maybe because he doesn't want to brag, or maybe because he's not ready quite yet to share it. Maybe he feels God has to reveal this.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem to be a boaster. He doesn't boast about himself, modest. in that way. And, it seems, when it's described, he stands heads above that. I don't think it's just referring to his height.
Great. Okay, so we are going to explore that. We are going to, I see your hand, Richard. We are going to explore that very question, right? Because now this is the first scene of Saul, right? We just read the first scene of Saul. And we have now seen where he began and the process through which he became the king. And there are things that we want to notice about that. Richard, did you want to say something before we keep going?
Well, I was just going to say that it sounds a lot like, I'm sure that you think so too, the story of Warren Harding, because Warren Harding, as you may remember, was selected from a deadlocked Republican convention, primarily because he was the most handsome man in the room, and everyone could not stop talking about how he would play out on the stump, on the back of trains or wherever they were, because he was such a good-looking guy. And we know how that worked out.
Well, so
This may work out the same.
right. So, what we will see, what we often see in the Torah is when physical features are mentioned, that they indicate something about that person being special. And what we see here is, that you're absolutely right. The description of him, Abby, being taller than everybody, very good looking, and Richard, your comparison to Harding, it seems like there is some kind of perceived natural leadership, right? And at the same time, the text tells us about his reluctance to say yes right away, his reluctance to tell his father. And then in this beautiful final scene, his reluctance to be named king when they, have this big ceremony where they pull his name out of the hat and say, it's Saul. And he's literally, hiding behind suitcases. Like he's trying to get this. He's the tallest person in the room. He's trying to be the smallest person in the room. He's trying to become invisible. Okay, I see Jim's hand. I see Lynn's hand. Then we're going to read some commentary and keep going. Jim?
Yeah, he seems very, very unsure of himself. In fact, I found it a little bit strange that he relied a lot on the servant as to tell him what to do. In fact, he asked the servant, what should I do next? And that just seems, going back to biblical times, as something that's not really something you would see in a relationship between, a master and a servant. So, I mean, that has to be in there for some reason.
Absolutely. That's a great observation. Lynn?
Well, something interesting in our more modern times, Asperger syndrome, characteristics of it that we know today. Good looks is one. A super intelligence, shyness, social problems, which I find very interesting with this.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That is interesting. Okay, I want to look at two of these commentaries. One is from my favorite, Robert Alter, that talks about his physical description. Alter says, the Hebrew literally says, from his shoulders taller than all the people. Saul's looming size, together with his good looks, seems to be an outward token of his capacity for leadership. But, spoiler alert, as the story unfolds, with David displacing Saul, his physical stature becomes associated with a basic human misperception of what constitutes fitness to command. So we're going to see that play itself out in just a few minutes. Stephen McKenzie writes, that these chapters, 1 Samuel 9 to 11, contains 3 different stories about how Saul became king. Saul is searching for some lost donkeys and encounters Samuel, who anoints him king. Then in the verses we just read, he is chosen by lot in a national assembly. And then in chapter 11, he leads the people in battle, after which they proclaim him king. So this, this progression, I think, is noteworthy because it is, it's showing us these different scenarios in which Saul is being kinged, right? In this prophecy way, in this very formal way, but then in his actions, in his own actions, which we will see soon. So what kind of a leader is Saul? Already we've talked about a number of these things. He has striking physical characteristics, which, we have seen before are noteworthy. But the question is, do they reflect his leadership, right? Here, it seems like his tall stature, his good looks, maybe they imagine that he's going to be a formidable leader. At the same time, I wrote down that he is a shepherd of asses. Now, what do I mean by this? Who is another leader who started out reluctantly and as a shepherd? Barbara?
David.
Okay, but maybe before David. This is some Bible trivia here. Esther, what do you got?
Isaac?
Oh, good. Isaac was a shepherd. I was thinking of like our big leader, famous big leader.
Moses.
Moses was a shepherd, right? Moses left the palace in Egypt. He ran away from home. He became a shepherd. And how does he get called back into service? Do you remember? One of his sheep goes astray, and he goes after it to find that sheep. And while he's looking for that sheep, God presents it as a burning bush, a bush that is on fire but not consumed, and speaks to Moses through the burning bush. For those of you who have spent time with sheep, I'm looking at you, Keith. What is the role of a shepherd?
Well, to keep the flock together and move it to where it needs to go.
Good. And
And
where
to protect the flock.
if you were the shepherd, where would you be in relation to the flock?
Probably, I don't know if I would have dogs do the work.
Okay.
Oh,
So generally speaking, you are in the back. You are in the
Behind,
back
yeah.
of the flock. You lead from behind. Okay. So I want you to stick with this leadership metaphor right now. A shepherd leads from behind. Now, if you have spent time with donkeys, how would you shepherd donkeys?
you'd probably lead them from in front.
Yeah, you kind of have to drag them
Pull
along,
them, right.
You have to pull the donkeys. So I think that this is very intentional. We have leaders like our forefathers, as Esther mentioned. We've got leaders like Moses. These are shepherds who lead from behind, who care for their flock from behind, who don't leave anybody behind. And then we have Saul, he could be a shepherd of anything, but he is not a shepherd of anything. He is a shepherd of donkeys. Okay. Already, there's something I find, I think that this is also meant to be a little bit funny, right? Our first king, it was God didn't want it in the first place. So who does God give us? A shepherd of asses, a shepherd of donkeys, not a Moses, but this guy, right? And he's not, he loses the donkeys too. I mean, we could keep going down the path, right? We also know that another Moses parallel is his reluctance, right? But he goes one step further than Moses in actively hiding in the baggage, trying to be invisible and trying to just literally say, anybody but me, just don't pick me, please, just, just keep going, in a very, very funny way. I mean, I think it's just hilarious. Whoops, sorry. We're not ready for you yet, Adrienne, almost. So the other part of the story that I want to mention, because it's going to come up in our part 2 of tonight, is Saul's character of insecurity. We don't see this very much in this scene. We see it one place. Does anybody remember where we start to see it? It's at the very end. When Keith was reading to us, he said that a bunch of people brought Saul gifts and called him king and flattered him. But there were some other guys who said, who is this guy? He's going to be the king? And it says Saul pretended that it didn't bother him, right? It
So
did bother him.
Yes, so does he hold a grudge?
We don't know, right? But, or like, also like, you were just named king. You were anointed king by God. Like, who cares if these just a few people are, not with you? But he cares. He is very sensitive. So we see that right away in this characteristic. The other thing, which we haven't seen yet, but we will see, is that Saul is a formidable military hero and leader. What he lacks in this chapter, he's about to make up for big time in the way that he's able to keep Israel's enemies at bay. And that military prowess is going to be one of his big features. So now I want to, okay, Anne, hello.
I also thought it was sensitive of him to think about his father when it was taking him too long to find the asses, that now his father's going to stop worrying about the asses and start worrying about him. I thought that made him seem like a sensitive character.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah. Okay, good. So I want to turn it over now to Adrienne, who has a special presentation for us tonight. And I feel very flattered that she joined us.
Oh, thank you so much. This is what I get for having typed Michelangelo into the chat at the first session when we were associating what words came to mind with David. Rabbi, thank you, all joking aside, for giving me this opportunity to talk about some artwork. Tonight it's just going to be one in the first instance. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Okay. So I think important to note, and we also haven't gotten to this yet, but Rabbi, please chime in here if I say anything that's incorrect, is that ultimately Saul, while a reluctant leader at first, doesn't want to give up his power and becomes, I think, increasingly afraid of having to cede that power. And it's in that context that we are looking at this Jack Levine painting from 1952 of King Saul. Levine, just to give you a little bit of background, was born into a Jewish Lithuanian family in Boston in 1915. He studied at Harvard. He worked for the WPA's, what did they call it? The Federal Art Project, and created some very striking public works, which really gained him a lot of renown. But first and foremost, Levine was known for being a social realist painter who often typically painted contemporary commentaries on social and political scenes. Interestingly, from what I've read, the death of his father in 1939 prompted him to start addressing Jewish subject matter in his art. And this painting seems to be a prime example of him bringing that kind of critical visual commentary to Judaic, and in this case, biblical subject matter. So it's an interesting painting. Levine was influenced greatly by the German Expressionist movement, which was prominent in the 1920s, a bit before he was painting, but apparently he was highly influenced by Expressionist painters Oskar Kokoschka, Georges Rouault, and Chaim Soutine, who's the first person that Rabbi Schachter and I talked about when we saw this painting, because it seems in some ways so reminiscent of a Chaim Soutine composition. It's tough to interpret, and I'm going to actually ask you guys, in a minute or two for some of your interpretations of this scene. But what I would say is notable is the sort of expressionistic qualities to it. So expressionism is characterized by very personal, individualized expression and raw emotion that often accompanies that. And this painting, for a figure who's supposed to be very handsome and very dashing and all of those qualities that made him stand out in the biblical passages, is really kind of caricature-like. I don't think he's particularly painted in a way that makes him look attractive. He looks distorted. He looks like he is clinging on to, I'm going to ask you guys what you think that is. I wonder if it's a Torah scroll in an elaborate cover that he's kind of clutching onto. And interestingly, I wish I had a pointer like in the art history classes. I don't know if you guys can see my pointer here, but it looks almost like there's some sort of dagger-like image here in the middle, which may be, an allusion to the fact that he is attempting to cling on to his power down the line. And, even if that means by force, since we know he was kind of a military leader. There seems to be a city in the distant background. I would venture to say probably Jerusalem. And again, that sort of configuration of space, which is in no way realistic or naturalistic, is another element of distortion that's characteristic of expressionism, and perhaps is emblematic of his own sense of his waning powers down the line. Things are sort of receding into the background there. So, these are just some of the characteristics that I found interesting. His physical distortion, there's a great sense of pattern to this painting, a very interesting and bold color palette, and again, that sort of distorted sense of space. Can anybody does anybody have a different interpretation of what he's holding? And most interestingly, what is it that's being emitted from the top of whatever he's holding? I'm really interested to hear what your interpretations are. So please, if anybody would like to unmute and share, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think he's very dour looking. He's very frightening looking. Almost looks evil in a way, with the hooded eyes and the very Semitic face, and the distortion of even his nose, what you'd see more like a Shylock type of character with a nose like that. I'm not sure what he's sitting on, whether that's a chair or a rug. And as you said, he's so large, but the city in the back is so small, making him look more important and grander than the city itself, because it's not in proportion of just being far away. It's almost like when you'd see Picasso or Chagall or whatever, where he's the main focus of that painting.
That's great. That's great, Carol. And I mean, of course, this is, a sort of late modernist work. All the modernist movements were emerging in, the 19-teens and 1920s and things like that. So this is several decades later. This is in the 1950s, but it still does harken back in so many ways to expressionism. Jim.
Yeah, I maybe this is jumping ahead, but he looks like he feels guilty of doing something wrong, which ultimately he did, because he disobeyed God's direction and fell out of favor with God. And it's almost like, he knows this and he feels very guilty and he's done something wrong.
I think that's a great interpretation. Rabbi, I don't want to commandeer too much time here. Richard Lasky.
it almost seems as though he's on a magic carpet, like and he's flying above the city, looking back over his shoulder at what he left behind and who might be chasing him, and holding what could be a magic lamp out of which a genie is trying to escape. It has that, Alibaba type of sense to it. And, Chagall was, just immediately his predecessor.
Excellent, exactly.
And so there are a lot of floating Jews around, and he might be one of them.
You may have just given me an idea for my next paper. Thanks, Richard. That's fantastic. Lynn Levine.
Hi. I don't know, what part of his life it's supposed to be depicting, but we know that at the end of his reign, he was fighting for his kingdom from David.
Exactly.
And that's what it looks like to me, like he's hugging everything that belongs to his reign as king. And we know that he had a mental breakdown, and that's the face that I see, that he's trying to hold on because he knows he's losing it to David.
That's very much how I interpreted it too. He's just clinging so tightly, and that dagger, if it in fact is a dagger, to me kind of symbolizes he's going to keep it by force, even if that's what it takes, kind of thing.
Right, or even use it on himself. You don't know, because he was in a very bad state of mind.
Right. Oh, well, thanks everybody so much. This is so much fun. And Rabbi, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Adrienne. That was really fun. And we're hoping that Adrienne will make a guest appearance in each one of our classes as we continue to explore different characters in the David story. Cecile, you raising your hand?
Yes, I just, when on his right arm, it could be Tefillin, and that made me wonder, when did Tefillin come into be the practice?
I don't know if he would have been wearing Tefillin, but that's an interesting question. I mean, but even if he wasn't, even if it's not historically accurate, that might be an interesting interpretation that Jack Levine is saying, right? Because Jack Levine is making a commentary on, on Jewish ancestry and Jewish ritual and Jewish practice. The one thing I just wanted to add, and then we have so much to do. Okay, is that Adrienne and I, we looked at a bunch of pieces of that were reflections of Saul. And I just want to say that none of them make Saul look good. Like, right? Would you say that's right, Adrienne? It's like, and
varying degrees of unflattering.
Right. When you think about David, who we are going to see was, a hero, but also a villain. He does some really nasty things, and we're gonna look at that. But if you look at the art world portraying David, there are pieces that reflect each part of his life, and both the flattering ones and the disturbing moments of his life. And we don't see that with Saul. For whatever reason, the portrayals of Saul, they speak to his unhappiness, his dangerous qualities. We were talking about a few that are towards the end of his life, where it's just basically, Saul being portrayed as a madman who's violent and scary. And I feel like this Jack Levine piece is it's so emotive. And I'm so glad that we were able to see it and think about it as we go into this next chapter. So now we're going to look at part 2, Saul and David. Okay. So what I have done is I have taken, some snippets of the David story in order for us to be able to follow along as in a short, succinct way, the story of Saul as it relates to David. Okay. So I'm skipping some parts, and I highly recommend you to pick up a copy of the David story, fill in the gaps for yourself, because I don't want to rob you of this beautiful narrative. But alas, we only have 60 minutes. So now we're skipping a few chapters in, right? Saul has been anointed. He is the king. It says, after Saul had secured his kingship over Israel, he waged war on every side against all his enemies, against the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Philistines, and the kings of Zobah. And wherever he turned, he worsted them. He was triumphant, defeating the Amalekites and saving Israel from those who plundered it. So you can hear in this language, right, this definitive triumph of Saul. The text wants us to know that he is a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Next chapter. The word of the Lord then came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me and has not carried out my commands. Samuel was distressed, and he entreated the Lord all night long. Now, we've seen this before, right? That God turns away from one person toward another person. And we don't know right now what that's going to mean for Saul. And I think it also challenges us to think, was his military success part of being part of God's plan, or was he such a good natural leader, right? Was he a pawn in God's game, so to speak? So after we hear that God is starting to change his mind about Saul, it says this: now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord began to terrify him. Saul's courtiers said to him, an evil spirit of God is terrifying you. Let our Lord give the order, and the courtiers in attendance on you will look for someone who is skilled at playing the lyre. Whenever the evil spirit of God comes over you, he will play it and you will feel better. So Saul said to his courtiers, find me someone who can play well and bring him to me. One of the attendants spoke up. I have observed a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite who is skilled in music. He is a stalwart fellow and a warrior, sensible in speech and handsome in appearance, and the Lord is with him. Whereupon Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, send me your son David, who is with the flock. Jesse took an ass laden with bread, a skin of wine, and a kid, and sent them to Saul by his son David. So David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul took a strong liking to him and made him one of his arms bearers. Saul sent word to Jesse, let David remain in my service, for I am pleased with him. Whenever the evil spirit of God came upon Saul, David would take the lyre and play it. Saul would find relief and feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Okay, so what do we know so far? What have we learned from this passage? How is David introduced to us? How is David introduced to Saul?
He's also a shepherd.
Okay, shepherd of sheep, right?
Mhm.
Okay, good. What else?
A musician.
A musician, right? He's like our first music therapist, right? He is able to create therapeutic music for Saul, who is plagued by some kind of distress.
It's
Okay.
reminding me of Joseph because he has a special skill.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph had a special skill with the dreams, and then he became a leader.
And
Okay.
he's also handsome, similar to Saul.
Right. He's got some really nice features too, right? Which we're told about right away. None of those seem to be relevant to why he's being hired, right? Which is to play music. But
And
we're given those because we need to know that for later, right?
And he also seems to know how to get along and ingratiate himself with the boss.
What makes you say that?
Well, the fact that Saul right away started to like him and he did exactly what he was told to do.
Good.
And he seemed to get along easily with him. And Saul might not have been that easy a person to get along with.
Right. Good. Okay, great.
But, there seems to be, I think there's one thing that's been left out here and that might explain some of it. And that is, God instructed Saul to destroy the Amalekites and all their possessions, and Saul just couldn't do it. And it's almost like he had enough of war, he had enough of killing, he had enough of destruction, felt guilty, and it began to get at him. And this is where this musical therapy would soothe him. So there seems to be, some connection. So I think that's a little piece that's sort of like missing, trying to explain Saul, and maybe he was suffering from, PTSD or something
Right.
from all the war.
Right. Okay. Great points. Great points. Okay.
What happened to the servant who was so instrumental before? It almost reminds me of the picaresque novel. I mean, we see that all through history, whether it was Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Most novels have the main character, and then they have a servant who really almost sometimes seems more intelligent than they are, and very down to earth, and manages to steer the hero in the way that they want them to go.
Okay, great. I love that. I love that comparison, because what we're going to see is kind of how this narrative turns away from that direction, right? There's a world in which Saul remains king and David is able to soothe him and maybe even coach him or support him. Again, leading from behind, right? But then something happens, right? And this story we're not reading tonight. We're going to read next time we're together, the famous story of David and Goliath, right? Which is a beautiful narrative. We will read it next time. I promise. We're skipping it right now, and we're going right to the good part, which is that David comes back from slaying Goliath. What's up, Lynn?
No, I just wanted to say, it seems like God is looking for a warrior.
Okay, what makes you say that?
Well, Saul destroyed the enemy. He may not have done it well, and now we know that David was a warrior and couldn't build a temple because of that.
Okay.
But it looks like God is looking for a warrior right now, maybe
All
to
right.
get
Okay.
rid of the enemies.
Okay, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Okay. So David has killed Goliath. He is he's a nobody. The story tells us that he couldn't even fit into the armor that they gave him. It was too heavy because he was so small. And somehow he's able to destroy Goliath of Gath, and he comes back. So the text says, when the troops came home and David returned from killing the Philistine, the women of all the towns of Israel came out singing and dancing to greet Saul with timbrels, shouting, and sistrums. So David has now entered into the military service because they've identified him as a leader, right? So David and Saul are both, out there fighting. But when they come back, this is what happens. The women sing as they dance, they chant, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Whew, that's a burn right there. Saul was much distressed and greatly vexed about the matter, for he said, to David they have given tens of thousands, and to me they have given thousands. All that he lacks now is the kingship. From that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit of God gripped Saul, and he began to rave in the house while David was playing the lyre as he did daily. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, thinking to pin David to the wall, but David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David. Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him and had turned away from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and anointed him chief of 1,000 to march at the head of the troops. David was successful in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he was successful, he dreaded him. Okay, I know we're running out of time. This is like such good drama. So I want to just lift up a few things that we're going to talk about that I put here on the screen. This concept of Saul's fear, okay? So what do we hear in this chapter about Saul's relationship with David? At first, Saul is drawn to David. David is a source of comfort for Saul. David is the antidote to Saul's madness, it seems. But then the narrative shifts and starts to lift up David's skill and prowess as a military leader. And it seems like this is the moment where Saul becomes afraid of David, that David becomes a viable threat for Saul, and his actions, which seem violent and angry, are actually out of fear. So I'm looking at the clock. I know that we have a tight turnaround tonight. We have to be off this Zoom right at 8 o'clock. But I just want to read this really quick. It says, we're told more than once that Saul fears David. Fear is a character trait of Saul's that reemerges in other situations as well. Saul lives this last chapter of his life out of fear, and that's what we start to see in the final days of Saul, that he's groping at any mechanism of strength to assuage his fear of no longer being king and of being overshadowed by David. Next time we're together, we're going to see how things resolve themselves with Saul, the end of Saul's life, the beginning of David's reign, and we're going to jump into a unit on David portrayed as a hero. So I want to thank everybody so much for being with me tonight. I know we only scratched the surface of Saul, but I'm just excited that we could get as much as we could in. And I want to thank Adrienne. Thank you so much. And to be continued. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, guys.